interact Spark1. And after we learn about the 4 levels of the brain apparatus communication, and we can give you an example. And the example is about the brain and music. Music is a product of the power of the human evolution, and also brain and music interaction covers all the banks of bark. For the first level, we call the bark 0, is we need to create music. We can create music from different brain regions and different circuits. And with the EEG FNIRS or fMRI, and we can see how the brain get activated when doing the music activity. That's bark 1, 2, 3. For the bark 1, and people sing or listen or dance or play some instruments. We use our own mouth, ears, feet, and hands. And for bark 2, we can generate the brainwave music with our just like EEG signal or some other signals that is called music BCI. And for the bark 3, we can combine bark 1 and bark 2 together, and we can see the group performance with EEG and the physiological signals communication. This is an example for the brain apparatus communication. And also, this is for the brain and motor interaction. And for the athlete training, the bark 1 is just like this kid is playing football, and with some techniques just like EEG ears, and we can do the motor imagery, motor rehabilitation, motor execution, and motor assistance. And for the bark 1, under this situation, the exercise and training for every day, we can see this is bark 1, and the communication between the brain and the body. This is the bark 1, and the bark 2 is about BCI, brain-computer interface. This is we can collect the EEG signal to control the wheelchair. And for the bark 3, and we can do the brain control and also the brain plasticity together. And yeah, bark 3 is the mixture of bark 1 and bark 2. And here is another example for the brain and heart. And we know heart rate can affect anxiety and also may affect other emotional behaviors. And yeah, they can interact with each other. So we have the 4 parts or the 4 levels for the bark brain apparatus communication. And we have some literatures already published different journals, and this journal, Brain-Apparatus Communication, Journal Biocomics, is our own journal. And also, this is a website, official website for the journal, and this is WeChat barcode, I think, and you can conference. And for the journal, and we launched the journal in 2022, last year, and we received about 20 papers, and some of the papers are still under review, and one paper was rejected. And for the geography of the submission, and most of the papers for now are come from China, but still some papers from Italy, Iran, Germany, and also the US. And we wish receive more papers from other countries outside China. And here are some popular articles published by the journal. And the first one, they had nearly 1,000 views. And this paper is from David Mailer and about the motor neurofeedback. And everybody can see all the articles in our official website. And this is articles downloads by region. And the China and the US downloaded a lot for the articles. And here are some prospects in this year. And we want to invite in more special issues. So if there is there anyone who are interested in organize a special issue, and are welcome to contact us. And we need to promote the journal in some academic meetings, such as the OHBM in Montreal this year. Maybe Anne can help us. And also we need to recruit more editor and also promote our journal in social medias, including Twitter, Facebook, and so on. And we wish to grow together with GBC family for better tomorrow, and also better for humanity and better for the journal. And thanks to the editor board of the journal, and we now have those editors from all over the world. And also we want somebody who are interested in our journal to join us, and please feel free to contact us. And this is our official WeChat account, and later we will have the Twitter and Facebook account. And okay, that's all. Thanks for your attention.
So Jinlu, can you like the projects that you intend to work on in the coming years, and as far as collaborations are concerned, what are the kind of collaborations you are searching for? Are you searching for people to help you with a theoretical part, or are you searching for I know some people are actually searching for other labs and other collaborators who have data, right? Maybe you have abundant data, so you could swap that for some expertise from some other side. So what are you exactly looking for? At least 2023, what's the outlook like from your side?
Maybe Jindu show the present
the slide.
Actually,
okay.
What we really want is more editors and more submission from all the countries, all the world countries. That's most needed.
Okay.
So if anyone of you are interested, you are welcome to join us as an editor. And also, special issues are welcome. So anyone interested to join us and organize special issue?
Okay. Can we get? Let me see. Let me check the. Can we get maybe an email address or something in the chat? Because I'm sure we would record this and then we would share both the video and the chat or something like that. I don't know. How can we contact you?
Okay, so I paste the website here. So if anybody is interested in this journal, so please visit this website. And also the submission port is also on the website. And this is the email. So if you have any question, and you can send us an email. And if you want to be the editor, or if you want to organize a special issue, also you can send us an email.
Present you our latest study using neurofeedback for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. As you know, post-traumatic stress disorder is a psychiatric disorder that's associated with flashbacks, high arousal, and traumatic remembering following a very traumatic event in one's life. So there are some treatments available for it, but not all are very effective. And we tried to see whether we can use neurofeedback to modulate some of the neural substrates that have been previously found to be implicated in PTSD. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey here in terms of how we actually came up with this protocol for neurofeedback and how it evolved over time. So it's basically spanning about a year of about 10 years, actually. And some of it has there's a bit of a twist in the middle. So hopefully you can pay attention for long enough to see this. But essentially, I want to start with some of the EEG rhythms that are involved in cognition, and especially this alpha rhythm that will be the target of the neurofeedback. And in alpha is usually associated with attentional states. According to this study here, you can see that during attention to visual stimuli, you have a decrease of this dominant posterior rhythm that is present in the alpha band around here, that actually decreases in power when a person pays attention visually. So actually it acts a little bit like a gate for information. So when the alpha is high, the information is blocked, and the person is usually internally processing something. And then when they want to pay attention to something external, like a visual stimulus, then usually this gate lowers and then information can flow through the rest of the cortical hierarchy. You can see also there's this antagonistic effect with gamma. So basically the brain kind of prefers to go to higher frequencies and decreases lower frequencies when there's attentional processing in the sensory cortices. Now, why were we interested in doing that? Well, because basically there is a link between the alpha rhythm and another well-known network is usually imaged with fMRI, which is known as the default mode network. And this is the network that has usually these nodes of the frontal midline regions and posterior cingulate cortex. And they found in simultaneous EEG fMRI studies that when the alpha rhythm is high, here in this kind of topographical location, then the default mode network is active simultaneously, metabolically. Now, the default mode network is that it's previously been implicated in a behavior that is called mind wandering, when people replay memories or plan things, basically when they think. And this network is especially active during these kind of states. So the idea for our neurofeedback study at the beginning, when I joined the lab of Ruth Lenius in Canada, was to see whether we can use neurofeedback to modulate mind wandering, given this link between the default mode network and the alpha rhythm. So because you have positive correlations here between these two variables and these two variables, between the alpha rhythm and mind wandering, in the sense where higher alpha rhythm would then be linked with higher mind wandering, and modulating the alpha rhythm would hopefully also modulate mind wandering. So that was our starting kind of basis and starting study in healthy subjects. And what we did was we wanted to see whether we could decrease mind wandering by actually decreasing alpha power in this kind of topographical region PZ electrode. And we had two neurofeedback groups. One was the real neurofeedback and one was the sham neurofeedback. So sham neurofeedback was just a replay of another person's EEG that had no real temporal relationship to the person's current EEG. Now, I want to introduce a little bit also neurofeedback. How is this done? How do people control their EEG rhythms and brain states? So neurofeedback is a closed loop method. That means that the first stage is the signal is received from particular senses. This can be an EEG signal or even MRI signal in real time. Then some features are extracted from it with a computer. So in this case, it would be the alpha magnitude. So I'll show you what alpha waves look like. But essentially, we're extracting this alpha rhythm, the size of the alpha rhythm, and then it gets classified usually in terms of dichotomously. So it's either classified as a high rhythm or a low rhythm, and then that gets represented on a video game, for example, where let's say this spaceship will move forward when the rhythm is high or low. In this case, since we're training the alpha rhythm to become low, then you would get positive rewards, i.e. the spaceship would move forward through space when the rhythm would be lower than, for example, the resting state baseline of the person. So that's a loop, and then the person gets the feedback, and then they can correlate their brain states or the behavioral state with what's happening, and they try to then, let's say, pay more attention to the screen, and if that lowers the rhythm, then they're getting more points, and so the whole loop is going around in circles, and that allows the person to kind of maintain that brain state as long as possible and as accurately as possible. So what does that look like in real life in terms of EEG rhythms? Well, here's an example of high alpha rhythms. So you see these oscillations here are very large. And these are the oscillations that are usually associated with mind wandering. And in this case, if there's such a signature, let's say we take like a half a second epoch, and we're estimating the size of these waves across time, sliding window. And then if this rhythm is higher than, let's say, the average level for that person, then, for example, this spaceship would stay stationary, and there would be no positive feedback. And that would be linked to reduced attention. But let's say that the person starts to tend focally to the stimulus on the screen, then they would desynchronize, they would reduce these alpha rhythms, and the EEG would look a little bit like this. And then this spaceship would suddenly start going through space, and that would be kind of a positive state where they would get points in the game. And so the idea is to train this kind of state of low alpha power for 3-minute blocks, 10 times 3-minute blocks, so over a period of half an hour, and then see, does that somehow create some kind of modulation in the brain activity post neurofeedback that is plastic enough to change behavior or maybe clinical symptoms in the end. So just a little video of what this looks like in real time. So here's some EEG. You see these oscillations. So if I play this, you can see the computer is tracking these oscillations real time. And then, for example, this game would then be reacting coupled to this EEG activity and react accordingly given these thresholds here that one sets. So that's neurofeedback in a nutshell. And essentially from this study with these two groups of healthy participants, we found that neurofeedback was more effective in decreasing this alpha rhythm you see here in the posterior regions than in the sham group, which received like a fake replay. So topographically, the neurofeedback group had a higher effect size. So that was successful in terms of people learning to do that within a single session of neurofeedback. What we also found in terms of EEG is that, as we hypothesized, that during the neurofeedback training, so normalized by the activity before the neurofeedback training, so the baseline before, that means the percent change. People when participants decreased alpha power during neurofeedback, they also translated that change into the resting state after neurofeedback. So you can see this positive correlation across most electrodes, where those that trained the most the alpha in the negative direction to reduce it were also the ones that ended up with lower alpha power after neurofeedback. So that's kind of seems to support a mechanism of plasticity, at least short term after the session. And that wasn't actually the case with the sham group. So although here there was some changes in alpha during neurofeedback or this sham feedback, this did not really translate into positive correlation with the resting state changes. So that makes us think that the neurofeedback did induce some plastic changes in the brain. Now, behaviorally, what was interesting was that actually we also found a positive correlation with mind wandering, which is also what we hypothesized at the beginning, that those people that would have lower alpha in the resting states would have lower mind wandering in the brain, in behavior, and that was not the case with the sham group. Now, we know that in PTSD, for example, people have problems with cognition and also attention, as well as mind wandering. So that was our initial hypothesis, that if we could find some evidence for modulating mind wandering, that we could then improve mind wandering also in this psychiatric group. So that was our starting basis, and we went ahead and actually applied the same protocol to patients with PTSD. And so in this case, we only had one group of 17 PTSD patients, but we wanted to see how does this neurofeedback protocol affect their EEG and whether they're also able to control their EEG. And actually, we found that, yes, they were able to decrease their alpha amplitude to below the resting state levels, you can see here. But interestingly, there was this so-called increase in alpha post neurofeedback, which was actually above and beyond the initial value that it displayed. That's not in line with the so-called Hebbian plasticity, where you would expect it to be at least the same or lower than at the beginning. So this is what we refer to now as the paradoxical alpha rebound. this you can see here, this is a successful decrease in alpha during neurofeedback. But what we didn't expect was that this alpha would be actually enhanced after neurofeedback. So almost in the opposite direction of what we intended to do, as if we also imagine that decreasing alpha would decrease mind wandering. So we kind of got a little bit confused about what happened there. But then in another study later, we actually sampled some control subjects and we compared their alpha activity with the ones at the beginning, with the PTSD patients at the beginning of that kind of intervention before neurofeedback, and we found actually there was significant difference between the control group, the neurotypical group, and the PTSD group. And actually, it seemed like the PTSD group was already very low in alpha. And then during neurofeedback, we pushed them even further down, and then somehow they also ended up more closer to the controls in the end. So it's so-called normalization of DG, but almost by going in the opposite direction. So that was all very interesting and counterintuitive, but it was in line with other research. In this case here, what it says is that increased alpha amplitude post-neurofeedback suggests normalization towards normal population levels. And actually other groups have also shown that patients with post-traumatic stress disorder at baseline do have reduced alpha power. You can see here, specifically for the PTSD group, is pretty much globally across the scalp in terms of alpha power. So there's multiple studies indicate that PTSD patients lack the alpha rhythmicity that's usually prevalent in healthy controls, as well as even people with this GAD, which is a generalized anxiety disorder. So this seems to be quite a replicable signature of patients with PTSD where they have lower alpha to begin with. So we will try to explain how come this alpha increased post-neurofeedback, and potentially one model that we're thinking about being maybe useful to think about it like this is from the point of view of different types of brain plasticity. Now, the Hebbian model would predict that the brain would yield in the direction of training, and that's the case in most neurofeedback studies where, for example, if you train alpha to increase during neurofeedback, then alpha increases later, or if you train alpha down during neurofeedback, alpha will decrease later. But in this case, we thought that maybe the homeostatic plasticity model would account for this paradoxical change in the sense where you see Hebbian plasticity has this kind of positive feedback where you drive the brain towards what kind of activity you drive it, and that gets generalized further in time by simple correlations. But in the case of homeostatic plasticity, it's kind of a negative feedback loop where the brain is trying to conserve a particular dynamic range, and once you go beyond that dynamic range, then it sort of brings it back. So in the case of alpha, we would have thought that we're bringing the alpha down. If it's already very low, then the system will bring it back up to restore it within this intermediate range. And then perhaps that's what's normalizing the activity towards population levels. And interestingly, when we looked at behavioral changes and as well as self-reports, we found that this rebound was actually negatively correlated with arousal. So we administered some questionnaires asking the patient before and after that one session, how do you feel? Do you feel calmer? Do you feel nervous? And so on. And we found that those that actually reported decreases in arousal or tension, that they actually were the ones who had higher alpha rebound post-feedback. So that was really an interesting mechanism there, especially in line with the psychiatric dimension of arousal, which is a kind of a cardinal dimension of PTSD, where most patients feel hyper-aroused and they can't sleep and so on. So that was actually also confirmed by other groups where they found that this alpha power, especially in source space here in these default mode regions, was negatively related to hypervigilance. So lower power would be associated with hypervigilance or hyperarousal. That was in line with our result pre and post neurofeedback. So we felt that this is enough evidence to maybe run a clinical trial to see whether this would have a long-term effect on clinical symptoms in PTSD. Also based on the fact that a previous study by Professor Relenius's group showed that this DMN default mode also was hyperconnected compared to control subjects, and that if upregulating these regions with neurofeedback in terms of alpha power, this alpha rebound might actually reconnect this default mode post treatment. So that is actually what we recently conducted a study in the last 5 years, and actually the results have just been published a week ago in Brain Communications. The design of the study was a double-blind randomized controlled trial, randomizing PTSD patients to either the experimental group, which was the real neurofeedback group, or the sham group. And in the case of the sham group, there were patients, and in the other group, we had 18. There were a couple of dropouts in the sham group. And then we also had a health control group with baseline resting state recordings to compare the initial baseline of these patients with that group to see whether it was abnormal or not. So just to start with the actual outcome of the neurofeedback, we found that actually the neurofeedback was successful as we expected to decrease alpha amplitude during neurofeedback. So this is the within session alpha amplitude averaged across all the sessions. You can see here normalized to 1. 1 is the beginning baseline. You can see that the neurofeedback group does decrease the alpha at the beginning of the session, and then starts to slowly increase. It is always below 1, whereas the sham group actually goes a little bit higher than the baseline. And that is also conserved across sessions, these 20 sessions. So that was promising. We then found that, and also replicated the previous findings of ours and other groups, that the PTSD patients did display lower alpha power at baseline, particularly in these frontal regions, as in studies of Clancy, as well as in the occipital regions that are linked to the visual cortex. So basically indicating that perhaps their cortical arousal is very high, given that the alpha is an inhibitor already. So that was a nice confirmation again of the same pattern. And finally, we did find a specific change in the alpha rhythm post neurofeedback in these regions of the medial prefrontal cortex, including a cluster in the default mode regions, default mode network regions. This was significant for the neurofeedback group, although we did not find any changes in the sham control group for the alpha band. And when we did a conjunction analysis of where this rebound occurred, we actually found that it overlapped with those regions that were abnormally low at baseline. So it sort of indicates a type of at least partial normalization of these key regions in the DMN that increase in alpha towards neurotypical control levels. And this obviously wasn't the case for the sham group, but that was promising. And finally, the clinical measures were also more important and significant for the neurofeedback group. So we found a significant difference post neurofeedback in the reduction of PTSD scale. So in this case, we had a treatment effect size of 0.75 at 3-month follow-up here, and we had a remission rate of 60%, which is comparable to current gold standard treatments of PTSD, and also no patient dropouts. So I think this is a unique advantage of neurofeedback based on the fact that it's a non-pharmacological treatment, and that even at follow-up 3 months, the effects are still conserved. So overall, that's the summary of our studies across these 10 years. And thank you very much for the study's collaborators. They include Andrew Nicholson, the first author of the study, and Ruth Ling is the senior author, and also to the study participants who were involved. Thank you for your attention.
Thomas, thank you very much. I think we have some time. So
yep.
If anybody has any questions, suggestions or anything, I think we have some time. We can have a discussion. So the floor is open.
I hope I didn't go through it too quickly, because I wanted to leave some time at the end. But if anybody has questions for me to revisit any slides that they're not certain of, I'm happy to do that.
Okay.
If that's okay, I think I would have a question. So this is really fantastically interesting to me. But 2 questions come to mind, one more generic and one more specific.
Mm-hmm.
The more generic or general one is this. if you were to imagine what would be a paradigm changer in the way we do biofeedback over the next 10 years or so, which one do you think would be the most disruptive innovation that could come to this field?
Well, biofeedback, you mean including
Neurofeedback. Excuse
neurofeedback?
me.
Okay, so
Excuse me,
yeah.
misnomer.
Sure.
Neurofeedback.
I mean, I think biofeedback has a very long history. And, you know, if I would talk about disruptive, I would say even just neurofeedback or biofeedback by itself as a concept is disruptive, because there are very few studies done on this concept. And, you know, usually treatments that are involved for psychiatric disorders these days still consist of pharmacological approaches. And so the disruptive aspect, and I think the paradigm shift, is also in thinking about what are the long-term effects. And I think homeostasis has a role to play here. Now, you know, this might be a long, maybe discussion about this aspect, but in my opinion, the main, let's say, Achilles heel of pharmacological approaches is that they are based on, you know, supplementing something that's missing in the system, let's say, or that's at least the model that they propose. So antidepressants, you know, restore serotonin or, you know, modulate serotonin to normalized levels. But the problem is that because the brain has these homeostatic mechanisms, it actually adapts towards those treatments. So the treatment becomes part of the system, and then even sometimes the system downregulates or upregulates depending on the direction, in line with kind of counteracting those effects. So therefore you have tolerance to the treatment because you need a higher dose. And also once you try to come off the treatment, you have withdrawal because the system is now even more imbalanced than at the beginning. So all those things tie the pharmacological treatment to the patient for the rest of their lives in some sense. Whereas with the biofeedback approaches or neurofeedback approaches, you're kind of asking the system itself to do the work and find, you know, a new activity levels that are actually emergent from the system itself. And then once you stop those, the system is robust. Let's say that's why we have these effects of 3 months follow-up that are, you know, there's no intervening treatment here between immediately after treatment and 3 months follow-up. So in some sense, you are independent of the treatment in the end, right? And in some other disorders like ADHD, it's shown to conserve itself over many months or years. So that's, I think, the disruptive concept, I think. But within neurofeedback itself, you know, maybe this homeostatic principle that most people were not really aware of and we really got kind of surprised by could be another way to, you know, regulate different brain states on top of this classic Hebbian way of going in a direction towards the mean. But that remains to be seen. I think ours is probably one of the few studies that show that this is the case, that it's kind of counterintuitive. But it could be the case that, I mean, we found a little bit of evidence for that also in ADHD, where you go in one direction and there's an increase in the end. But we don't know long term what the effects of that are. The only thing I can say that could be interesting from the point of view of the actual behavior is that most of the patients didn't display any reactions during the neurofeedback, which maybe you would expect to occur because they're going kind of away from the mean. So that's interesting, and the fact that they found it easy to control. Now, a lot of patients also, if you were to say, okay, try to increase alpha power directly, that will usually require them to relax, which is very difficult for them behaviorally. And so therefore, to increase alpha for them might be more difficult than to decrease. So in the end, what would be an interesting other design to do, another study would be to compare, you know, to normalize alpha, but try two different approaches, either directly increase it or go decrease and then see the homeostatic rebound later, and then see which one is more effective for patients with less let's say negative consequences, although we haven't found any negative consequences in this study. It's a long answer, but hopefully.
But it's a splendid answer. Thank you. Really very interesting. The second question that I wanted to ask is more on the implementation side, and it pertains to the features that we base the feedback upon. Now, I'm not really an expert in this area, but if I have understood correctly, to date, the features that we use are in a way relatively low-level features, such as the alpha band power, etc., etc. But on the other hand, we do appreciate that the brain is a highly complex, non-linear system. So the question that comes to my mind is, do you think that in the future there may be a shift towards higher level, more abstract features, for instance, network level synchronization patterns, or non-linear signal features such as entropy, etc., etc., or is that taking it a step too far?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, and thank you, Ludovico. It's an interesting question that we also kind of ask ourselves every time we try to go a little bit beyond and try to innovate in neurofeedback further. And I'm sure that there will be many studies trying exactly what you're saying, especially now with the advent of deep learning, where these features could be multivariate,
Exactly.
and black box even. So in terms of neurofeedback history, and also it's very close also to the BCI field. The point about the BCI field is they try to classify features kind of behaviorally, and they just look at, okay, classify this, how this brain state is most related to a particular behavior. Now we took a kind of different, more like a priori approach by looking at neuroscientific literature. We know alpha is linked to excitation inhibition balance. It's more like a neurophysiological, let's say, angle on things. But you could also take the machine learning angle, as you say, where you say, okay, well, we want to first capture what makes people feel relaxed, and then we decode that state in the brain with EEG, and then we say, okay, just try to promote this multidimensional space that is the most linked to relaxation. And if it has all these different features in it, well, like networks or entropy, different values, then you can try to modulate that directly. And I think that is definitely logical and worthy of investigating. The only thing that is sort of first question that would come to my mind would be, okay, is it easier to control in this closed loop? Now, you would think that maybe if it's closer to a particular behavior, more specific particular behavior in the machine learning sense, then they would be able to control it more successfully, right? Because they would find some kind of more behavioral or neurobehavioral state that is closer to control in this kind of open closed loop. So that could be interesting. Now, the question is, how does that then relate to the physiology? Does it have any plasticity? Does it translate in this Hebbian or homeostatic sense? Those questions I don't know the answer to. So it still remains to be seen. But the BCI literature shows that people can control these kind of features from the decoding point of view using, like, for example, support vector machines, or I'm sure in the future will be with deep learning. So, and then maybe that also is more interesting from the point of view of patient heterogeneity. So if we have a high dimensional space, and let's say there's a normative database, but it's also high dimensional, usually the problem is that, okay, you can identify a few features that are abnormal, but which one of those features do you choose? So you kind of go for the main one that's the most abnormal, but it could be, as you say, the whole family of features that are abnormal, and then you want to modulate all of them at once, if that's even possible. But I would assume ideally that's what you would want to do, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Actually, forgive me, this leads to a last very quick question. Since you've made the link with BCI, one aspect that I have always found quite fascinating is the notion of BCI literacy, i.e. the fact that there is a certain percentage of the general population who seem simply unable, for some unclear reason, to use a BCI system. Now, in your experience of neurofeedback, in the way you have been working on it, is there really a considerable fraction of the population who cannot engage in the task, or actually it is more favorable than BCIs? Well,
you see, I mean, BCI is an umbrella term for any kind of closed loop, decoding, and as well as control. So it's almost, 99% overlaps with neurofeedback as a concept. Now, the only difference, in my opinion, is that the BCI is trying to decode something and not assumes any kind of long-term changes, and also maybe use it for kind of communicating with some external devices, but in essence, the literacy part is is the same for both neurofeedback and BCI, right? So yeah, it's a great question because yes, we know that, for example, in BCI, there's whatever 20 to 30 or 50% of people who cannot control some BCI features. And the main feature is what, like motor imagery and so on. And in this case, we don't use motor imagery because we don't think it's necessarily neurophysiologically relevant in this case, but it could be for other applications like stroke. But in the grander scheme of things, yes, you do always pretty much have some illiteracy, depending especially on what the features you select. So the main kind of difference between the two fields in some senses being what the features that we've selected. Now, of course, BCI is motor imagery, mainly motor imagery kind of protocols. So they use, they modulate mu rhythms in the motor cortex. And for those cases, they're lateralized. And even in those cases, something like 20 to 30% illiteracy there. Now, the reason why we always kind of last 10 years been going on this alpha protocol is because, alpha was the first rhythm to be discovered. And also it has very high signal to noise ratio. So in some sense, BCI field is really alpha. The mu rhythm in the motor cortex is pretty much the same feature, but we're looking at it from the parietal point of view. So visual cortex or visual processing, which also is very easy to modulate with attention. So in our experience with alpha, at least, and that's kind of why this is kind of survived as a feature in some sense across studies, is that it's very easy to learn. So I don't know whether we have any illiterates per se in some sense, because everybody can visually attend as long as they're cognitively capable. So I would say maybe 10% or even less in most cases, people cannot really decrease their alpha in a closed loop. So that's really beneficial. And it has also this link to EI balance and so on. So overall, this seems like an interesting feature to modulate. And then, of course, there's all this self-tuning going on in the brain with homeostasis, which in some sense is kind of more, maybe even independent of the process, but you need to kind of heat up the substrate to get these kind of self-organizing changes. And it's very interesting also from the point of view of self-organized criticality models of the brain, where the brain is kind of tuning itself to some middle levels of spiking or synchronization. So it fits with these kind of models of the brain trying to self-regulate its activity, and that maybe these brain disorders are kind of maladaptive plasticity disorders, where they're a little bit away from criticality, and then as soon as you perturb the system a little bit, it will come back to the mean or tending towards the mean, because that's an attractor in the brain system, right? And you know more about criticality than me, but I would suggest that that's a really interesting model to think about it from that way. So yeah, so I think it's important to try to use the most simple features, maybe not the most simple, but at least the ones that are the most easy to control, because if you cannot control them, then I don't really see a model or a framework there for inferring plasticity being based on that perturbation. So if you cannot perturb the system from the spontaneous state, either one or the other direction, up or down, then you're not really inducing any kind of changes in that signal, right? So I think it's going to have to be a combination of the overall effect on long-term plasticity as well as the short-term effect of online control. So you have to have both of those to make a successful neurofeedback treatment. And if you have illiteracy, then obviously that isn't a good feature per se for those ones that cannot learn to use it.
Thank you very much. Very clear explanation. Thank you.
Thank you.